A te api chihinku ki, na wonia wakanki he, wakanta ka wajina ki, he wawita yuha nue. Amen. I am Bradley Hauff. I live in Minnesota, but I am originally from South Dakota. If you don't know where South Dakota is, it's south of North Dakota. My last name is spelled H-A-U-F-F. H as in hotel, A as in alpha, U as in uniform, and two F's as in my high school report card. I'm just kidding. Not about South Dakota. That really is south of North Dakota. I am enrolled in the Oglala Sioux tribe, as were both my parents. You just heard me pray the doxology in the Lakota Sioux language, and I greet you with the Lakota words, How mutakiepi. How mutakiepi. Translated into English, this means, hello relatives. Hello relatives. The Lakota people greet one another with these words, and not just fellow human beings. To the Lakota, as with virtually all indigenous people, everyone and everything exist in a state of relationship. People, animals, fish, birds, insects, every living thing, and even that which to the mind of Western civilization is not living. Winds, rocks, and the stars and planets of the cosmos. When Lakota people pray, or whenever we speak, we typically conclude with the phrase, mitakwasi, mitakwasi, which means all my relatives, all my relatives. To indigenous people, the universe is a living being, alive and well. The earth and the cosmos in its entirety are our relatives. They are not our possessions to exploit any more than one of your relatives would be. Think of it. All that is your relative. If you haven't yet seen things that way, think of how it would change your life and change your world if you did. I am the Missioner for Indigenous Ministries for the Episcopal Church, and I am pleased to be with you on this, the Sunday before Indigenous Peoples Day, which is tomorrow. I am a member of Presiding Bishop Michael Curry's staff. Please know that you are in the Presiding Bishop's prayers and that he is grateful for your work as faithful and active participants in the Jesus movement. The Jesus movement is not an institution, but a spiritual and social revolution in the name of Christ. There are three aspects of this movement that I want to highlight: loving, liberating, and life-giving. Loving, liberating, and life-giving. These are the three things that characterize the Christian faith and life. Anyone or anything that is loving as God loves, anyone or anything that liberates the oppressed, whether the source of the oppression is outside of us or from within ourselves, anyone or anything that gives life to the world. Loving, liberating, and life-giving. That is the Jesus movement. Before joining the Presiding Bishop's staff, I spent 27 years in congregational ministry. My last ministry in that capacity was as rector of a church in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where I served for about 5 years. Now, Philadelphia is a city which, like many metropolitan areas, unfortunately, has a high crime rate. In fact, while I was living there, my car was broken into 4 times, and the house where I was living was broken into once. That's 5 burglaries within 5 years. I could hardly believe it. And each time I was burglarized, and I'm not making this up, each time I was burglarized, the burglars took nothing. Nothing. Not one thing. So after this happened a few times, I started to feel really awful. Not that my place was broken into, but why didn't they want my stuff? Is my stuff that bad? Why didn't they want my stuff? You know, it was embarrassing. You know, I tell you, when I get burglarized, I want a burglary I can be proud of. I want to be able to say, yes, my place was broken into and they took everything. They took it all. I've got the best stuff. But that didn't happen. Well, anyway, my ego issues aside, and all kidding aside, stealing is a terrible thing. When things are taken from us, we feel violated, exploited, and hurt. And then we get angry. That's a normal response. And there are small things that can be stolen and large things. Indigenous Native Americans have been dealing with this on a large scale, a very large scale, for many years. Our land was stolen. More than that, our identity was stolen. Our very understanding of who we are and how we see the world was taken from us. In our first reading from Isaiah, we are told that a city, the holy city of Jerusalem, occupied and controlled by ruthless tyrants who have oppressed the people, has been overthrown. It has become a heap, a ruin, and in its place, a haven has been established on Mount Zion. The prophet says, "The song of the ruthless was stilled. On this mountain the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wines, of rich food filled with marrow, of well-aged wine strained clear. And God will destroy on this mountain the shroud that is cast over all peoples, the sheet that is spread over all nations. God will swallow up death forever." The prophet is referring to the restoration of Israel, telling how the people of Israel's world will be changed, turned upside down, and in a good way, a way in which the poor, the oppressed, the needy, the refugees will live a life that is in harmony with the ways of God, in right relationship. It sounds to me a lot like the indigenous worldview, the way things should be. But sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes our worlds are changed in a way that is not good. I'm with you this morning to talk about that, about how the church, unfortunately and tragically, was instrumental in it, and how we can respond today. It all began with the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery, something that most people have never even heard about. Originating in the late 1400s, the doctrine of discovery consists of several edicts and manifestos, initially from the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, which influenced the objectives of Columbus and his successors, and was later enforced by other religious and national leaders, including the monarchs of England. The doctrine of discovery gave the church's sanction to the seizure of land and subjugation of the indigenous residents of Africa, the Western Hemisphere, and the world under the claim of a right of domination by a Christian nation over non-Christian people and their land, under a conviction of divine right and the guise of evangelism. The intent of the doctrine of discovery can be summarized as a blessing on the dispossession of land, wholesale theft, slavery, and enforced indoctrination, all in the name of God for the perceived good of the world. In the centuries that followed, the objectives of the doctrine of discovery became known in the United States as manifest destiny. And the Western Hemisphere, once populated by tens of millions of indigenous people of many nations and tribes with their own languages, social customs, and spiritual expressions, was utterly devastated. Entire tribes were wiped out due to murder, pestilence, famine, and deportation. We will never know how many millions of lives, indigenous lives, were lost. Totally unlike the characteristics of Christianity, this theft was not loving. It was based very much in hate and greed. It was not liberating. It was the opposite, the worst and longest lasting oppression in human history to the present day. It was not life-giving. Millions of lives were taken. It was theft. It was genocide. It was and is sin. One person whose life was directly affected by all this was my father. From age 5 to age 18, my father was raised in a residential school operated by the federal government on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. This practice of raising indigenous children was commonly done in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in this country. It was a method of assimilating them into the dominant culture of the United States. Captain Richard Henry Pratt of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School of Pennsylvania, which was the flagship Indian residential school, described this process as killing the Indian in order to save the man. I remember my father telling me what it was like for him. After his arrival at the school, he said every evening he would go down to the front gate, an iron gate, and wait. He would wait, he said, wait for someone to come and take him home. He did this every evening for about a year. Then he concluded that the somebody he was waiting for wasn't coming. So he cried. He told me he would cry into his pillow at night so no one would see him or hear him, because you didn't dare show grief or sadness or fear at the boarding school. You would be beaten up if you did. Eventually, my father became angry, and that anger stayed with him for most of his life. When he became a parent, he really didn't know how to be one because he didn't have parenting. He wasn't raised in a family. That was taken from him. His childhood was taken from him. His understanding of who he was as an indigenous person was taken away from him. In this country, for over a century, many indigenous children were taken, stolen, just as the land was. It turned their world upside down, and in a way that was cruel, inhumane, and, in a word, evil. Land theft murders a culture and a people. Land theft murders a culture and a people. The key to healing, transformation, and redemption is through reestablishing the cosmic and sacred relationship that indigenous people have had with all that is, by turning the world upside down, but in a good way, a way that is loving, liberating, and life-giving. And it must begin with us. Jesus says in our gospel reading from Matthew that many are called, but few are chosen. We Episcopalians tend to joke about how if this were about us, it would be many are cold, but few are frozen. It takes a while for some of us to warm up. At first glance, this would seem to mean that the chosen are somehow a cut above those who are merely called. Many are called, but few are chosen. The chosen are seemingly better qualified. But I don't think that's what's happening here. I don't believe that any person is somehow better than the other, somehow more equipped than the other. Indeed, the power of God is made known when those of us who are small in number answer God's call and do great things. This happens because the power is with God, not us. Our task is to answer God's call and allow God to work through us and do the rest. I've heard it said that God does not call the qualified, God qualifies the called. God does not call the qualified, God qualifies the called. And we are all called. Called to love, called to liberate, called to give life to others, called to turn the world upside down in the name of Christ and in a good way. It is time, and has been for many years, for all the people of the Christian faith, and all people for that matter, to reject, to repudiate the doctrine of discovery and manifest destiny. I am proud to say that the Episcopal Church did this in 2009. That's a very important thing to know. It is time for us to recognize that if we teach the false narrative that Columbus discovered America, we are saying that there was nothing here in America and no one here in America that mattered before his arrival. We are saying that God was somehow an absentee landlord of the Western Hemisphere prior to 1492. We are celebrating an individual who initiated the worst and longest lasting genocide in human history. No, it is time to turn this worldview upside down. God was and is present with indigenous people, always has been. And it is time for the church to learn from the wisdom of indigenous people, and for all of us to commit ourselves to living in right relationship with God, humanity, and all of creation. I stand with you as your brother, and you as my Christian family. We're not perfect, but we are called. And when we respond to God's call, we are chosen to do the work of God. We are in this together. And I pray that during this pandemic and time of national crisis, when so many of us are tired and sad and lonely and fearful and hurting and angry, we will stand together. Stand together for justice. Stand together for peace. Stand together for healing. Stand together for reconciliation. Stand together for love. Stand together for liberation. Stand together for the giving of life. We are the family of God. We are all related. So let's turn the world upside down, and in a good way. Mitakwasi.